developed world. Now I have to rush a little bit. In Asia, we have some factors that are favorable. We have urbanization. Urbanization means when people move from the countryside to the cities. In China, only 29% of the people lived in the cities in 1996. Now it's 44%. So a lot of people move every year to the cities. In fact, it's the biggest migration in the history of mankind. 20 million Chinese move from the countryside to the cities every year. And in India, we have an urbanization of just 30% here. 700 million Indians, they live in the countryside. So they will also move to the cities over time. And that will, of course, support some economic growth in Asia. I'm not talking here about stock market performance. I'm just saying that there is growth in Asia. And as people become richer, obviously, they consume more. And they buy also more goods and services and commodities. And so that essentially boosts the demand for commodities and also the prices. And in the case of China, I'd just like to point out that the demand will not disappear overnight for the simple reason that they have very little copper, they have very little iron ore, and they have very little oil. And so the Chinese demand, essentially, especially because some industries are expanding very rapidly. And I have to again say we live in unusual times because never before have the economic geographies changed as quickly as now. As an example, you can see here the share of Chinese steel production as a percent of world steel production. It was 10% in 1990, it's now 44%. In 20 years. Aluminum was 10% here in year 2000, it's now 35%. In 10 years, you go from 10% of world production to over 35%. This never happened before in economic history. And that has, of course, huge implications on the demand for certain goods and services, commodities, and also, of course, precious metals. Now, the Chinese, they have one advantage. This is the low leverage. You can see here as a percent of the economy, credit is 100%. The world champion is Britain at over 500%. The US is also, if you include social security liabilities, also over 600%. So basically, the Chinese economy, and by the way, also emerging economies in general, if you go to Russia, there's hardly any mortgage market. You go to Turkey, until 2 years, there wasn't a mortgage market. In Vietnam, where only 8% of the people have a bank account, there's no mortgage market. People pay cash in Vietnam when they buy a house, normally in gold coins. And so that allows, when financial institutions come up, for borrowings to go up in emerging economies. That stimulates then economic growth and leads to also higher incomes. Now, I showed this before. Basically, in China, we have a very low per capita consumption of oil and other commodities. This is India. If you compare it to, say, South Korea, Japan, the US, the oil demand in the US is more than 10 times higher on a per capita basis. In Japan and South Korea, it's also about 8 times higher. So, in time, this oil demand in China and also the demand for copper and for other commodities will obviously go up very substantially, and that will lead to, as I said, rising demand in India and China, and in my opinion, higher prices. Now, some people will say, well, oil at $75 is expensive, but I can turn around and say, no, it's not expensive. Because with all the money printing, the quantity of money is rising much more rapidly than the supplies of oil. And, you know, the oil experts can debate about many things, but everybody agrees that the major oil discoveries were here in the 1950s and early 60s. And since then, every year, the oil discoveries have gone down and they have become more expensive. To find new oil today and drill it, you need an oil price of $70, otherwise it's not worth doing it. And every year, the world consumes significantly more oil than new reserves are added here. And so over time, if you consume more than you add reserves, then obviously your reserves, the overall reserves, are going to go down. And every oil field, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to see that, every oil field eventually runs dry, finished, gone. It's not like a farmer who can plant wheat every year. With oil, you burn it, it's gone. And so my view is that actually oil in the long run will be much higher. And this leads me to another subject I discussed before, but now it's becoming more interesting. We had an oil crisis in the 70s. At that time, the US was 77% oil self-sufficient. Only 23% were imported. Now the US imports 74% of its oil requirement, and 26% are own oil reserves, because the oil production in America went down. In the case of China, we have the following situation. The reserves are going down. The production is flat here, and the demand is up. They're the second largest oil consumer today. And they were self-sufficient in the 70s, in the last oil crisis. But this time around, they have a huge disadvantage. Just consider the following. The US has access to two oceans, the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, and they can get their oil from Venezuela, from West Africa, Angola, and Nigeria. They can get it from the Middle East, they can get it from the North Sea, and from Canada and Mexico. But in the case of China and the whole of Asia, we get all 95% of the oil from the Middle East, and it comes on the sea lanes. So the Asian nations, in particular China, is very vulnerable to an interruption in oil supplies. And the US is very vulnerable to an interruption in oil because they import 75% of its requirement. And so the US is here in Iraq certainly not for human rights. And the Chinese are in Sudan, certainly not because of the scenery. It's about resources. For the Chinese, you have to see that there's a country with 1.3 billion people. To secure the resources is a top priority. And that, of course, leads to tensions, because the vulnerability of China is they don't have an aircraft carrier. They're very efficient submarines and also rocket systems. But basically, the problem of China is this. The US has access to the oceans, Pacific Ocean and Atlantic Ocean. The Chinese have access here to the Pacific Ocean, but the problem is they're surrounded by American bases. All around here in the Pacific you have American military bases, and the Americans have aircraft carriers, and they can block the oil supplies to China. This makes China very vulnerable. So the Chinese are building a pipeline here through Burma to the Andaman Sea, and they're building a pipeline, they have built a pipeline to Kazakhstan, but would like to extend it essentially over time to Iran. And you have to see, the Americans, they have now bases in Central Asia. Neither the Chinese nor the Americans have any interest in, neither the Russians nor the Chinese have any interest in a permanent American basis in Central Asia. Because for the Russians, it essentially encircles them all around, and for the Chinese also. And so I think the tensions will escalate over time. And the Chinese, they don't want a Taliban victory, but they could make a deal with the Taliban and say, listen, you leave our Muslim population in China alone, and we'll give you weapons. And they don't want the Taliban to win. But they certainly don't want the Americans to have bases there forever. And so I think this will be a huge problem going forward. And then there's another point I'd like to make. Recently, several studies have been published by well-known economists. And all these studies have essentially pointed out that stimulus packages by the government, in other words, government spending, has a multiplier of less than 1. So if the government spends $100 billion, it doesn't stimulate the economy by $100 billion, but by less. With the exception of one, if you have high unemployment and you have military spending of $100 billion increase, then obviously it stimulates the economy. And so my view is that the monetary policies and fiscal policies of the US will lead to nowhere, that they'll have more stimulus and eventually down the road more problems, and at the end, in order to distract the attention of the people, the government will go to war somewhere. They are already at war.